Hello, welcome to the third session of this willow and tissue course. Today we're moving on to more advanced techniques and we'll be looking at curved forms. We'll begin by looking at what we can make with circles, so spheres and tubes for example. We're then going to move on to look at a couple of examples of working with spirals, and finally we're going to have a look at curves to make leaves, petals for flowers. Willow is naturally a bendy material, so you can flex it to some extent even if it's very dry, but if you push it too much it's going to snap. The key to working with willow is to stretch it gradually, and a good way of doing that is to use something like a bottle or a jar or something that sort of size, cylindrical, and just slowly work it around that hard surface, gradually stretching it on one side, and you can get much better curves. There you go, snapped because I pushed it a little bit too far. But you can get much better curves that way. That snapping is quite useful for you to see about how far you can push it. So if you want to get really good curves, you really need to soak the willow. 2 hours should be long enough in the bath, or I soaked it in the water before, in a stream, anywhere that you can find. This piece has been soaked overnight, which is even better. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to wipe off the wetness. You'll notice this sort of brown gunk coming off. So it is a little bit of a messy business. Wipe that off. And now I'm going to start bending that, and hopefully what you will see is it bends much easier. There we go, look at that, bending really very easily. You need to take your time with this, okay, a little bit at a time, working all the way along, including these whippy ends at the very end, and then you've got something which is really very flexible. And the first thing we're going to make with this is a circle. So I can take this now and bend it around, loop it around to create a circle, bigger or smaller. The very end of the willow tends not to bend very much, so I chop that little bit off. And there we have a circle. I could wire this together or tape it. I'm going to show you taping. It needs to be a good tack masking tape, not decorator's tape, which is low tack so it doesn't take the paint off when you lift it up, but a higher tack one. And what I'm going to do is wrap the masking tape all the way around both pieces and back on itself, and that's very important because it doesn't really at this stage stick that well to the willow because it's wet, but it does stick quite well to itself. I'm going to trim that and then get more tape and wrap that around, binding it nice and well. Bit more tape. Don't be stingy with the masking tape. You need to use a lot to get a good fix. There we go. So it's held together nice and strongly. So I've got 3 rings of the same size, and I'm going to make a sphere. So I'm going to join two together at right angles to each other, like so. Masking tape, could use wire, and put that across the joint and under, and make sure it wraps around all of the pieces. Might need a little bit more masking tape on that, and the same on the other side. Make sure that's nice and even. So a bit more masking tape. This time I'm going to start underneath. I think it'd be easier. Under, wrap it around that one and the one next to it. Wrap this one around and around onto this one. So I'm trying to make sure it's nice and firm. That's those two. And now my third one goes at right angles to both of them. Slip it on the outside. Just coax it in. Oops. So it'll have to go on the inside. That's it. Work out where it's going to fit size-wise. And then I can join those together like so to make a basic sphere, and then in between I can start to infill that to make a more solid shape. Notice that I'm using the thicker ends of the willow. The thin whippy ends are good for infilling in between, but the basic structure I'm making out of thicker willow. And I'm just going to show you one that somebody made earlier. So this piece incorporates two balls joined together. This one has extra pieces in this plane, so here and here. This one has extra pieces moving around and also diagonally across. And then it's all been joined with another piece of willow curving through here. Got a little bit of a hole in it, they do break quite easily. You might want to try creating a ball or make some rings and play with them a little bit more loosely and abstractly. Here's another one which is much looser and more abstract. So rings, curves, the willow being joined in a little bit more of a random, more abstract way to make an abstract hanging. So your first step today is to have a play with curving soaked willow and dry willow. See what sort of curves you can create. Think about joining them together, either creating balls and building on that, or playing around with curves in a more loose, abstract way. Something else you can do with circles is join them together with straight pieces. So I'm just joining 4 straight pieces around this one. I'm joining them in the middle, so I'm going to put one more on there. To do this, I take a nice sized piece of tape, put it about where I want it, put this on, and then I need to fold it over in both directions and fold it around each piece to hold it nice and steady. And what I'm now going to do is add another ring the same size in just there, and then a smaller one a bit further on and pinch it in at the bottom. So far so good. So you can see that as the smaller ring goes in, it pulls in and then comes to a point where I join pieces at the end. So just join up the other end now. Notice that the pieces aren't quite the same length, so I've got to work out how I'm going to join them. So that appears to be the shortest one. I'm going to start with that one. take some tape, wrap it around. I'm going to join it to the one opposite it. So sorry, get that back in the camera so you can see it. So I'm now wrapping around the other piece, the same piece of tape, back around the first one, under and around, so those two are secure. Make sure they're lovely and secure. I might put a little bit extra tape on there. That one, you can see, is definitely too long now, so I'll take my secateurs, just cut it down. Then wrap tape around this end, bring it into the others and wrap the tape under and around. Last piece again needs a trim. Always remember to wrap the tape around all the way around the stem to help it secure. People sometimes ask, you know, how do you decide whether to use tape on a joint or wire? It really does depend on what you think or what you find works the best. So cross pieces, you know, definitely wire can be as good as tape. Ends like that, you really have to use tape. So you just got to try it out and see which works best. And there we have a pod shape, or torpedo, or whatever you would like to call it. If we were to do the same thing but with a couple of curved pieces, we're going to get quite a different shape. So here is a piece of willow which I curved whilst it was wet and left to dry. I curved it on this. This is a basic jig. A jig is any sort of device which helps you shape something in a particular way. So the basic jig, this has rows of screws which I can bend things around to get different shapes. Somewhere I have some other shapes that I've bent around on this different ways, so I'm just going to show you those. These two pieces were made with the same jig, just varying which screws were used. So you could do the same by banging nails into a piece of wood. Just make sure the wood is fairly thick so that they don't bend under the strain. Jigs are very, very useful, and I'll be showing you the use of them in some of the other projects in this session. So I've been working on this a little bit, joining rings in. I've brought the rings smaller this side and joined the ends. Notice I'm just doing the two pieces at the moment. I'm not doing a third or a fourth piece. That will come later on. But at the moment that leaves me maximum flexibility. And notice how it flexes and moves depending on how I join things together. I think what I'm going to do now is I'm going to bring those ends together to finish it and then add the other pieces in. So quite like those ends being a longer piece. So I think I'm just simply going to tape them together for now. Get that tape nice and tight and bound around. Okay, now ready to put on other sides. By the way, it doesn't have to be 4 sides. It could be 3, it could be 6, it could be as many side pieces as you like. So a number of ways that I could put on these side pieces. I could put individual pieces all the way along. For example, I could put in curved pieces. I could use straight pieces. I could just about manage to put in dry willow, but for maximum sort of bendiness and flexibility, I've got some soaked willow, and I've flexed it first one direction for half it and then the direction for the other, so it's going to curve quite easily. I'm going to join that in and then join another piece on the bottom. So I'm going to start by joining this piece on one end, so taping it into the end here, make sure it's nice and firmly fixed. So I've got the curve going in the right direction. Yes. I'm just going to work my way along, taping it on. So here's my bendy creation. And now to apply skin. Now, with anything that's curving, you have to be a little bit careful about how you apply. You can't apply big sheets at once. It's probably best to do it in small sections. So maybe that shape, or maybe just about to there. But if you apply too large a sheet, you're going to get something that's very, very wrinkled, and that would be a shame because you'll lose the shape. So just to quickly run over applying the tissue, I've got a piece of acetate. That's to put the tissue on. This piece is being cut to go on that section. And I've got watered down PVA, which I'm going to put all the way through it. The acetate is so it doesn't stick to the table, basically. On the frame, I'm going to put undiluted PVA. I'm just getting out of this jar. Apply it generously. Make sure you have plenty on the masking tape too. Lots on there. Then I peel this up carefully. Place it on, trying to get it tight as I can. So just pull those edges and go around the edges, if possible folding them under, and if you can't, you always trim them later. And making sure it's nice and firmly stuck down on the willow. To move on to the next section, I could probably do this section, but if I want to move it around without sticking to the table, I need to dry that section. So I take my hairdryer, put it on a low setting, and dry gently. For a few minutes, and once it is nearly dry, you can put it on the high setting. Turn it off a second. But if you put it on the high setting straight away, you are quite likely to burn the tissue loose. Okay, so start on a low setting. Whoops! Low setting. There is my finished structure, ready to be decorated if I want to. Although I quite like these shapes in white. Next we'll look at making a spiral shape like this, loosely based on a shell. So my starting point is soaked willow, drying it off, and then flexing it again, exactly the same. So taking it, bending it carefully around, do take your time with this. I'm rushing just a little bit. Okay, and this time I'm going to start at the whippy end. Now, if you look at that end, actually some of that is really too thin to work with. So I'm going to chop it off. You can see it's got a little break there already. So I'm going to chop that off. And then I'm going to start to coil this into a small loop. Like so. I'm going to take a piece of, get a piece of wire this time. You could use tape. I'm choosing to use wire. It's a slightly different finish. And I'm going to bind that together, twisting the wire around to hold it in place. Nice and tightly. That's my center. Then I'm going to start to curve outwards, just sort of bending this around. Oops. Okay, I've got that coiled round to where I want it. And now I'm going to bend the piece inwards. So in order to do that, I'm squeezing. So I want an angle. I'm squeezing the willow nice and hard to flatten the section, and then it will bend nice and easy inwards. What I'm going to do is I'm going to wire it there, but I'm also going to wire it temporarily here whilst it dries. Okay, so take a piece of wire. This is a little bit more awkward. What I'm going to do, slip the wire under and then just give it one twist to start with. And I can let go of that bit and start to bind it, wrapping the wire around every stem. And this one. And then to hold it in place, I continue that line across there. Put another piece of wire there. Just is that right? Yeah, just adjust it a little bit. And another piece just there. When this dries, I'll be able to cut that piece out and the willow should stay in that curve. Okay, but I just need to leave it to dry now. So here's one that I did earlier. I want to turn this into something a bit more three-dimensional, a little bit like this one that somebody made previously. You'll notice that the final coil, in actual fact, they're done with wire, but the principle is still the same. So I need to make a second piece, which is exactly the same size as my original. In order to do that, I've created what's called a jig. This is my jig. And what I'm going to do is take the willow and twist it around there. So I have dried and flexed my soaked willow, and now I'm going to create a loop around the screws in the middle with the whippy end. Secure that with some wire. So twist the wire around the two parts of the willow that overlap. Get it nice and tight so it doesn't slip out. And then I'm going to start to take the willow around the jig. Take my time, making sure that it is bending nicely. Following the curves of my design, using the screws to just sort of hold it in place, but the curving you need to do by hand. There, to that point. Then at this point I'm going to take some pliers and squeeze it in order to flatten that section, which makes it easier to bend it without it breaking. Then that will just bend down there. Now it will hold just tucked onto those screws for now, but I will put a little bit of a tie there anyway, which we'll need when we take it off with the jig. So that needs to be left to dry thoroughly, and when it comes off it should hold its shape. The willow can take a few hours or even overnight to dry. If you're impatient to get on with your work, what you can do is, once you've got this bent into a shape, is put in supporting pieces around it, spaced out, to create some sort of pattern, which is what I'm going to start to do now on this one. So I'll start there. I'm going to cut a piece that would fit into that gap. The end pinged off somewhere. I'm then going to take masking tape. These techniques were covered in the first two sessions, but I will just repeat them. I'm going to wrap the masking tape around the end there, and then wrap it around the spiral, trying to make sure I go over the joint on both sides so it's nice and firm. Take another piece, again wrap it around piece of willow. This is dry willow, I should have said that earlier. It's nice and rigid. Wrapping it around the frame. If I carry on doing that, I will then be able to finish this off a lot quicker. So I'm going to add the other pieces in. There it is with its spokes in, and as you can see, the spokes add an interesting pattern as well to a piece of work. Here are the two halves to my shell, and as you can see, I've put uprights coming up from this one at the same point as where the spokes are on this one. Just this is exactly the same as session 2, making the stars. I'm now going to take this and tape it onto the uprights, so I've got a 3D structure. There, that's now ready to apply tissue. I've applied a single piece of tissue to both of the sides of this now. I've applied it like a pie crust, if you like, a little bit bigger, and dried it with a hairdryer. It's still a couple of wet spots, but it's largely dry, and now I can take a knife and work around and just trim that neatly off. So you can see it's just coming very easily, trimming off to neaten that up. And then I will do exactly the same on the sides, probably using longish panels, because I can use a flat piece, because I can use a flat piece of tissue all the way along that sort of area. So there's the finished thing ready for decorating. You'll notice how the pattern shows through very nicely through the tissue. There's a different pattern this side. Notice also that I left one end open in case I want to put lights in. Here's another spiral idea which I'll just talk you through. Is a ring here at the bottom and attached to it 4 verticals which are then joined at the top. A piece of willow has been flexed and then joined at this point here. Let's move it back into the camera, and then twisted slowly, touching each point around and around and around up to the top. And here it is with a loose skin of tissue over the top. Starting point for this flower is the simple petal form. So a piece of soaked willow bent around a curve and then the 2 ends joined. If you want, you can make something much more complicated. For example, I made this one using a jig. It's much bigger, but that's up to you. For the purpose of demonstrating, just working on a simple one will help me show you everything that you can do. So the first thing to say is, although it's curved in that direction, I would also like to see it curved in this direction. And this needs to be done while it's still wet. It's got some flexibility, just need to be quite careful. And what I'm going to do is physically attach it to a curve, like I've done here. So, I'm just take one end and to join that as well as I possibly can. Try and bind that in place nice and thoroughly. So plenty of masking tape. And then push and bend it so that it's curving, and tape on down the other end. So whilst it's pushed and bent, get that tape on any way that you can to get it to secure. Like so. So it's just keeping that curve still. Here's one I did earlier, which I'm going to cut off because it's dried. Get that tape off and off of this end. And what we should find now that it's dried is it's kept that curve. Okay. Of course, you might want it to curve in 2 directions. I've set up a jig here. I've screwed 2 different size tubes and bent the petal through there and then secured again with 2 screws. Okay, those are the petals that I'm going to make. I'm going to make a few of those and then join them together around a ring. So I now have all of my elements ready, a ring for the center and bigger and smaller petals. The smaller petals curve in one direction, the bigger ones curve in and out gently. So I'm going to attach some wire to the bases of these so I can wire it onto the centre and then cover them in tissue. So I've now got all my pieces ready to assemble my flower. I've made a central piece which is a little bit more elaborate. It's a ring with more rings joined to it. This is for two reasons. One is to act as a basket to put a light in, and the other is to represent the centre of the flower. It's fairly easy to make something like this, and I'll show you in a minute how I did it. But what I'm going to be doing is taking, first of all, these smaller 4 leaves and wiring them into the base, and then I'm going to wire on the bigger leaves. In order to get through the tissue, I'm just going to puncture it with a bradawl or a sharp nail, big needle, anything like that would do. Focusing for a moment on the dome in the middle, this looks more complicated than it is. It started with a central ring and 2 slightly smaller rings taped in at angles like that, and then more added on. So I think I had 3 in one direction and 2 in the other, but all taped in the middle, all joined towards the sides to create that dome shape. Right, on to putting my flower together. So I've punctured a couple of holes in the dome, and now I'm going to thread through carefully, pulling that tight just a couple of times, threading that through, and similarly with the other one, and then I will bind them together at the back. So turning it over, just sort of twist those nice and tightly together. So I've got my leaf joined on. Right, 7 to go. So what I have now is my basic flower, and what I can start to do is shape it by bringing pieces up, and I could join them together like that. This is what I think I will do. Now I could join them with wire, or I could join them with a little bit of glue. I think I'll try just a little bit of glue. So there is my final flower. I'll just show you in a moment what it looks like lit up. You can find lots of other examples of willow in tissue art using curves on the internet, so it's worth doing your own research and perhaps trying to develop some of your own ideas, or you can just explore 1 or 2 of the techniques that I've shown you in this video. That's all for this session. Next session we'll be looking at animals. Bye bye.